Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Parag Rastogi, Director of Real Asset Analytics at GRESB. It's hard to underestimate the pivotal role that the global real estate sustainability benchmark, GRESB, has had in shaping sustainable investment strategies. But more than that, how it has shaped how we measure the performance of an asset. Many, if not all, of the standards and benchmarks we have discussed on this show feed into this. It has trillions of dollars of assets in its system. We discussed GRESB's evolution from a broad portfolio level assessment to a detailed asset level evaluation, looking at the need for standardized data collection and performance-based metrics. We talked about the challenges of data availability and the significance of relative benchmarking, and the shift from disclosure to performance metrics. We talked about the future of indoor air quality assessments within GRESB and the importance of operationalizing this data to enhance real estate value. Parag thinks deeply about these subjects and has his finger literally on the pulse of the real-world performance of these spaces. It's a fascinating window into how we value things like risk, benchmark success and failure, and operate in a world that is, frankly, vital to have on our side to change air quality for people in the built environment. We really are back with a bang with this episode, and it genuinely was a fascinating conversation. Please don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Parag Rastogi. So I think the fascinating thing for us to perhaps open with is maybe how you describe what GRESB is to people. I mean, because I think people have probably heard the term GRESB floating around quite a bit, especially if you're anything to do with real estate. But I think probably no better man to explain exactly what that is and why it exists than yourself, Parag. So perhaps let's start there. What is GRESB and why should it matter to people?
So GRESB started about 15 years ago. And it is initially, to begin with, it was an initiative from the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. And it was funded and promoted by like three major pension funds. So two from the Netherlands, one from the UK. And what they were looking to do was, as they do global investments in real assets, so both real estate, but also infrastructure like airports and ports and motorways, whatever, anything that's real, as opposed to, say, securities and shares and things. They needed to know what was the risk from a climate perspective, from an energy perspective, from a sustainability perspective of the investments they were making, right? And one big way they could do that was to have this standardized survey that they could send out to their investee companies and say, hey, fill this out, give me some essential information about your practices from management all the way through how you manage an actual asset. So I can figure out, and once we do some processing to it, standardized processing, which has backing in econometric literature, I can then figure out what my risk exposure is, right? And the reason this matters is because when you think about what these pension funds are trying to do, is they're trying to hold assets or make money off owning assets over very long time frames, right? You're investing now in your 20s, in your 30s, in your 40s into a pension. You need it in your 70s and 80s. There's a big time lag and there are lots of people and so on. So not only did these pension funds realize that they had some power because they had so much money they could invest, large chunks, but also surprisingly, they had no visibility into the risks inside those businesses and how they were managing their assets, despite having all that money and power and investing.
That's really interesting, isn't it? So at a really fundamental level, this is about the people that were investing in assets over really long periods of time. Before something like GRESB, you were literally relying on the theoretical performance of a building and what a valuer said it was worth 15 years time when it came to change tenancy, or another 15 years on from there when something else changed, right? So there was nothing supporting that. And I guess at the same time, you're seeing more and more interest in things like the long-term energy performance and climate resilience of buildings, and sustainability was starting to build and become a thing. So that's fundamentally what GRESB is answering then, I guess, is it? It's that this is the long-term performance of this asset on key metrics, which I guess we'll come on to in a minute, that determine how that building is performing over the period of that investment.
Yeah, exactly. And you and I are buildings people, so of course we think in terms of buildings. But I would like to clarify that GRESB's entry point is the company that owns assets, buildings, right? And so you have managers who specialize in owning real assets. They will form a company. Let's call it Fund A, right? And Fund A decides that my interest is in office buildings in London and Dublin and Birmingham and Glasgow, right? So that's what they go out and they buy those buildings, and then they hold them, they manage them. They might appoint a manager like CBRE or JLL, Knight Frank, any of the big ones or smaller ones or local entities. They have FM, they have a renovation plan, they have a tenancy plan, they go out and find tenants. This is sort of the classic way that people earn money and own buildings. So GRESB actually is trying to evaluate the company, this fund that you've created that owns a bunch of assets. And that could be anything from a fund of one building, like the Empire State Building is a fund of one, which is unusual to be fair. But we could have like a dozen buildings, let's say boutique offices in Frankfurt and Munich and Stuttgart. Or you could have literally thousands of assets, let's say self-storage units or last mile logistics in the UK and so on. Our biggest markets are in the UK, Japan, the US, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe, Northern Europe, with lots of expansion now happening in Asian countries, so East Asia and South Asia. So the coverage truly is global, right? Every continent is represented. And that's one of the reasons why it makes sense for, let's say, you're a pension fund manager in London, in the Netherlands, in New York. How are you going to go figure out a way to evaluate buildings in every company that you have invested in and every building that company owns, when it could be literally thousands of buildings, right? And that's where GRESB helps to standardize. And to your point about what did you have before, well, you could ask those companies for information and they could choose to respond or not, right? Depending on how they understand their fiduciary duty to be. And there is this interesting thing that I learned in the world of finance is when you own, I think it's less than, when you ask a question about less than 5% of a balance sheet, the person doesn't really have to respond, right? So if they could feasibly say that every single building is less than 5% of my balance sheet, so I don't need to tell you anything about it, right? I think that's a little bit of a stretch in terms of interpretation of what risk is. But anyway, the point of GRESB is transparency and information in a standardized fashion. Of course, the topics are determined by the industry through consultation. So we, as professional staff at GRESB BV, which is the for-profit company, we advise the foundation, which owns the standard, on what the topics could be, how we could develop them. So we are sort of the muscle for the foundation. But ultimately, it's the foundation which is governed by the industry that tells us, go look at physical climate risk, go look at air quality, go look at well-being, go look at energy and GHG. And this is how, and we present options, and then they will tell me, for energy efficiency, look at ASHRAE 100. For air quality, look at 62.1 or SIPSI, equivalent SIPSI, or allow local standards to be used, right? And so, for example, in the infrastructure assessment, we actually ask for literal quantities of SOx and NOx and stuff emitted by a facility, say a power plant, right? So these are all, the topics are all governed by the foundation, which is the industry. And they, of course, change over time. In 15 years, we've changed a lot, right? But there's always been this notion that you can have You can be assessed as a company itself, like how are you running this company in sort of your basics, which in fact now foundation has told us is literally just it's the basics, it's the fundamental. You need this to even be considered in part of the system, how you run a company. So it could be stuff like how do you manage your supply chain, how do you manage labor practices and so on in your supply chain, and how do you treat your employees and things, right? And then the second part is when you own an asset, how do you run that asset, right? So this is kind of how the world of GRESB thinks. And I will use the word asset, which in GRESB doesn't always mean a single building. It can mean a group of buildings as well. So a mall is a classic example. Could have multiple buildings, but could be one asset.
So to go right to the top of the pyramid here, just for a moment, GRESB basically you have a foundation which is the standard, which the industry, and by the industry you mean real estate, effectively, guides the foundation on what is important to measure, right? So as we've seen the transition towards energy performance of building directives, ESG over time, we've seen, I guess you've seen what's important to the sector evolve. And then GRESB, the company, I think BV you said, is basically the muscle behind it, is the machinery behind that. That you say, okay, you want to look at that. We then need to figure out how that's implemented, managed, assessed, the science, the maths behind it. And I guess we'll come on to it later. That's a lot where you come in. So it's interesting that at the very top of the pyramid here, there's basically a foundation that is assessing organizations that manage real estate to provide the investors with a level playing field, apples with apples, oranges with oranges, to understand what they're looking at and how that risk evolves over time in a way that means something to them. Is the GRESB Foundation then quite an interesting barometer for the sentiment of that sector in what it's looking to see? Because, you know, obviously we've seen, particularly in the US, quite a shift in the political landscape and what's important and so on. You know, we've got energy performance of building directives, so now moving into implementation phase in Europe. You know, globally, there's a lot going on at any one time. I'm guessing GRESB then is a real fair weather signal for what's happening in the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really a weather vane here because the foundation board is the governing board, and then there is a committee for real estate and committee for infrastructure, right? And this is just how we've divided things up in the past. It's actually more fluid than it sounds, between what is infrastructure and what is real estate. And then there is new lines on data centers. That's a new line. And then a new board, governing board or committee, sorry. And then finally, there's one for lending. So when you lend against a building, how do you know the risk against it? The real estate and infrastructure standards committees are made up of people that own and manage buildings on behalf of investors, but also the investors themselves. So they're also present in that. So we do get this interesting dynamic between investors and managers. We also have a couple of we have representatives from large sort of, I don't want to classify them as consultancies, but they are consultancies in the sense that they don't themselves own the building, but they advise like the Japanese market. We have a representative from GBC Australia. So we do try to get a wide variety of opinions and expertises and regions. Regions is also very important, of course, because you want it to be global. And yes, as a result, we do hear the wind shifts and people's opinions shift. And what's interesting is that there is, of course, a little bit of selection bias if you're volunteering to work on volunteering for the foundation. Well, you're volunteering to work with GRESB in the first place, and then you're in the foundation. We get people that are actually interested in making real estate, real assets more sustainable, more risk proof as far as possible, climate responsive and climate responsible, good for people. So all these the fundamentals have not changed.
And that's really interesting to hear. And that's kind of the trope that you get from that sector, is that because these are pension fund timeframes, they're well beyond political cycles. So generally, I mean, and it's very non-sentimental finance. I mean, it's pure risk. It's they really want to understand how buildings are going to be viewed and valued, but also the risks that are involved in that devalue or what have you in those sectors. So they are looking at this from often a very non-political perspective, and saying, well, look, yeah, as far as possible, but even still, and I've spoken to some of your colleagues, you do see shifts, particularly at a regional level, shall we say, because you are going to be swayed by the tides of politics. Let's just say that's just inevitable.
Yeah, and there are hot button issues. There are hot button issues that say you can't use the word net zero target in the US anymore if you've been invested in by the state pension funds, right? Whereas if you look at the state pension funds or teachers' pension funds from Canada, the UK, Netherlands, Sweden, and all that, they definitely want a net zero target. And so it's up to us to figure out the balance between what we allow people to say credibly, so long as we all agree this net zero and decarb nearly zero are more or less the same thing. And let's not split hairs here about who's right about this, right? So we do allow a little bit of flexibility in how you not interpret the questions, but how you respond to the questions, so that there is regional flavors and what you consider to be material and so on, right? So there is even like materiality assessment, and just to clarify, materiality in this context means what is material and immaterial to risk, as opposed to how architects would talk about materiality, which is the material with which a building is built, right? It took me a long time to figure that out in GRESB.
Yeah, and you've got, and I don't know, even within ESG, there's a materiality as well, which can mean something very different. So, like, materiality is a term that's used in different ways in different sectors. So, yeah, we might come on to materiality later to dive into that a little bit. No, that's really, a lot of this is wordology. I mean, we are effectively talking about the same thing. And from a finance perspective and an investment perspective, what we're interested in is the sustainability, the non-green version of that, the finance version of that, of an asset over a longer period of time, and the realities of the environment and its impact on those assets. You can't, that's the great thing about science and physics. There's some fundamentals behind this that regardless of the wordology you use to describe it,
doesn't care about your opinion, doesn't care about mine.
It just is,
right? If you're building floods, your building has flooded. I'm sorry, I don't know what you feel about it and what you thought your opinion was going to be, but your building's flooded and you can no longer let it out, or it's damaged beyond repair, or nobody can get to it. If you're a logistics facility and now it's flooded, it's effectively disabled because nobody can get to the logistics facility.
And you can argue about who the bogeyman is and who's responsible for that as much as you like, but at the end of the day, your building's 4 foot underwater. So that's a risk that the people that are investing in pension funds and me as a pension holder want to be sure that my pension funds are thinking about, ultimately. Yeah. There is
ultimately a lot of this, of course, in GRESB, for the first phase of GRESB was exclusively asking questions at the portfolio level, so the company level. The next phase was saying, actually, you need to respond some things at the asset level. So things like energy use intensity, I need to know actually at the asset by asset level now, rather than aggregating it up to the portfolio level. And that happened in 2020, which was an interesting time to ask about asset level metrics. So it really messed up our data for a year or two. And then in 2028, which I'll come to in a moment, why I'm talking about 2028, but it sounds so far away. In GRESB world, that's almost tomorrow, right? We are actually shifting largely from, and I don't want to use this word as an insult, but from intention-based assessment to performance-based assessment, right? So when you ask a survey, And people who do air quality are very familiar with surveys and all their shortfalls. So when you said it's sort of unsentimental finance, and they're looking at risk and looking at long term and things of that nature, there is an element, of course, of asking, when you ask a manager, do you have a climate risk policy? Do you have an air quality policy? Do you have a health and well-being policy? I can ask for that policy, but I'm not able to judge, is that really a credible policy? Is that really actually, are you doing something on the ground? Is something changing, right? But when you don't have data, that's the best you can do. You can ask, do you have policies? Have you thought about this? Is there somebody responsible for this? So these are what would have been considered in sort of the last decade's sort of sustainability and risk assessment. But the new decade demands that we actually look at performance where we can. Now, coming from at least partially a background in air quality, I am also aware that you don't want to measure things just for the sake of measuring them without knowing what is the relevance of those things, right? And so we are now shifting to performance, and we have divvied up and this is all public information. So, and I'll send you links later so you can post it as part of that. We are now shifting the assessment, or the score for the assessment. So you get a score at the end of the assessment. Sorry, I did mention that, out of 100 points. And then we rank and sort all the companies based on those 100-point scores, right? And then where you stand, top quintile, bottom quintile, middle quintile, whatever it is. So we are doing some reforms, and what we're saying is most of the assessment after 2028 will actually be performance based. And what performance means and what we actually measure is being addressed subject by subject based on maturity. So the most mature subjects are energy and GHG, energy and carbon. The next mature subject would be maybe climate risk or health and well-being, embodied carbon, because we're only talking about operational carbon in the first place, and so on. So we're addressing this subject by subject, and we're moving every subject towards measured performance as much as we can, of which, of course, air quality is a particular passion of mine, and how we can get it in, right? I think in air quality, what I found, the shortfall is not that I don't know what to measure. I do know what to measure. The trick is, how do I link that to financial outcomes in sort of that broad perspective? I'm not talking about productivity here, because, and people might disagree with this, but I don't know if I want to chase productivity through air quality, right? I want to chase more along the lines of, is this actually a health promoting place that you're building, or are you creating air pollution problems? Are people being exposed unnecessarily? Those are the kinds of metrics I would care about. So this performance shift is philosophically a very big deal for the industry, right? It's not a big deal for, I'd say, building science or data science, obviously, because we need data. But for real estate, to go to every manager and say, hey, give me your energy reading. How much renewable have you done? What is your on-site combustion? And then in the future, what are the measures you've taken against flooding? What are the measures you've taken to ensure clean air inside, and so on? These are questions that a lot of managers, especially on the ground, would consider quite intrusive and just too much to respond. If you have thousands of buildings, how do you aggregate this and this kind of level? Am I supposed to spend money on an audit of literally every building? It's fine for somebody who owns London office to say that, because the audit is, nobody needs to go very far. Each building costs a lot of money, and the audit as a percentage of the building's value is nothing, right? What if I own, hundreds and hundreds of sites scattered across the country? Then what, right? So we have to be cognizant of those kinds of considerations as we develop anything.
Well, and I think that evolution is reflective of many of the other, and we'll come on to it, the kind of the badges and the standards that we see around the place, that it's a reflection of the evolution of the technology that's available as well. We've seen all of these standards, and GRESB being no different, moving from largely a checkbox process. Do you have a lobby? Does it have double doors? Do you have a policy for this? Do you have a standard for that? All those kind of things, right? And slowly starting to move into what's the actual measured energy performance of the building as a whole? What's the measured performance of X and Y, and so on? And I think what we've seen technologically over the last decade is an ability to record and upload that information being much easier than it was a few years ago. So my first involvement with GRESB was probably, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where we were starting to think about air quality, but at the time we were also looking at IoT and the ability to clamp electrical meters onto floors of buildings and start to aggregate that. And, so this ability to upload data, people with early recollection of GRESB will remember fairly long spreadsheets of having to fill stuff out. I guess that's all evolving. And you're right, the London asset was in one location, but also probably would have had one of the big four controls companies involved, and therefore pulling that data was probably easier than if you've got a bunch of, let's say, the long tail of the real estate asset dotted around the country, where some poor bloke has got to go down to the basement of each of those buildings and read a meter once a month or whatever it is, right? From here to here, there's a huge gap in what that practically meant. But that's changed, and is changing quite quickly. Now, we're not seeing that into all assets yet, and I guess that's, maybe we'll come on to that, is that data availability, how you see that playing out at the grand scale, not just air quality, but and this is what listeners need to realize. And actually, Joseph Allen talked about this in his Healthy Buildings book, about this idea of a long tail of real estate. The real estate is quite an unusual class of finance and ownership, in that very, very small percentage of companies actually own a very small percentage of the buildings. Actually, the real estate class as a whole is made up of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of owners of buildings. It's an incredibly disparate group of structures from an ownership and management perspective. And while we talk about, the LinkedIns and the Deloittes and these fabulous, amazing headquartered buildings this is what we imagine when we think real estate. But real estate is the office above a shop in a high street in Birmingham. It's a warehouse and office in Midwest United States, out in the middle of nowhere. It's a school, it's a public building, and so on and so forth. Actually, when you think, and the ownership structure of that is enormous. So this is a big undertaking, isn't it? When we say this is a big leap for people that are investing and managing in real estate, this isn't about turning a switch. This is a fundamental change in how we view buildings, and that's going to take time, isn't it?
Exactly. And what I've realized is spreadsheets are very hard to kill, right? And so the spreadsheet you're talking about, Simon, still exists. It's evolved. It looks very different. It's got new colors. It's got new tabs. It's got new funky stuff in it, but it's still a spreadsheet. And from a science perspective, it's where a lot of intentions go to die, because when I need to implement something cool and I'm like, well, this is really helpful, and everybody agrees this is helpful, but when it comes to the data and you want to give it in a spreadsheet, it kind of breaks down. So we've been moving people towards APIs as well as the platform, like a web page itself, especially as we scale. And there's a whole sort of cottage industry of consultants that will help you make that transition. So certainly data gathering procedures have improved in the last decade as technology has evolved. And we saw this in my previous job. I did the same with air quality sensors and ARC, where, why do I need a spreadsheet when the system can send a message to the system, and we did a bit of reset as well. And I really liked Reset's sort of pioneering work on air quality, sort of as on a server side, so that you don't have to actually, no human gets to touch any part of that data stream, and it just goes from sensor. But interestingly, if you look at the GRESB, the evolution of the GRESB data availability, which is crucial to making decisions, it actually is bimodal data distribution. Right? So just to get nerdy for a second, what that means is we have a lot of people with very high data coverage. So 95% to 100%, essentially full data coverage. They can give me all their energy data. Energy is the most mature by far, so I'll use energy as an example. But the same sort of logic applies to water and waste, which is the other two things we measure. And I think it'll be the same when we come to air quality. That's my hypothesis. And then you have this other mode, other peak on the very low data availability side. So 0 to 5% data availability. And then in the middle, there's basically almost nothing, right? There's very little. There's a few cases. For example, think residential ownership. So if you're a company that owns a multi-family apartment block, you can know the electric because it's sort of going in through a common, but then you can't know the heating, and you might know the common areas, but not inside the tenants because the local laws don't allow you to extract that data. So you can get stuck in the sort of in between 0 and 100%. What we realized is that over the last 5 years, as we have pushed on it, people have invested in getting better data so that the peak on the low data availability has gone down and the peak on the high data availability has
but
gone
still
up.
Nothing in the middle.
But
so you're not seeing a flattening and a broadening of that bell curve of the mode of no data. It's basically going from no data to full data. There isn't really a middle ground here. Something poetic about that, isn't there, with data? It's very binary, right? You either have data or you don't.
exactly. And it's to do with how much control you have over the building, what kind of lease structure you have, what kind of building it is, right? So in certain building types, it's harder to get than others. And as you were just saying, there were also, if you're a high value asset in a certain leasing structure, investing in, say, smart metering infrastructure, sensors, IoT is a such a small consideration. You don't even have to think too long about it. Just do it, and you get your points, right? And the thing I'd like to point out to listeners who might not be aware of this is, from about 2020 to 2028, we'll be when we'll be changing. It's data coverage that gets rewarded. Do you have data? So this is a disclosure-based paradigm, right? As I said, it's intentions, and the intentions basically is evaluated using disclosure. Can you tell do you have a policy for health and well-being? Well, give me that policy so you disclose that policy and I can evaluate it. Do you have energy data and water and waste data for a building? Give it to me. I'm not going to tell you, are you efficient? I'm just going to check that there is data, right? So then we introduce some efficiency measures as well, saying, okay, well, if you do, surveys and audits, and if you do programs around tenants and communities and things, then there is some measurement of, like, okay, what's the change over time? The interesting thing is we have realized that there is sort of a diminishing marginal returns in investing more and getting more data. There are certain types of real estate where data is just not going to come to you because as a landlord, you can't access the data because the tenant has certain rights or has certain business practices that mean that data is not available to you. And this is going to be even more acute for something like air quality, because now I'm not asking for energy data, which is sort of once removed from your business activity. I'm actually putting sensors into your space, which I would argue that those sensors can't really measure anything that's business sensitive, right? I've built those sensors myself. There is nothing I can put on there that would tell me what you're doing as a business, right? But there will be some sensitivities around that, and we will work to ensure that our tenants and landlords are appropriately aware of that. So we are figuring out how to be more sensitive and sophisticated about these different classes of real estate, which is not the classic sort of sector, which is building type. That's something that I know very well and we use all the time. The other dividing sort of axis is location. So where you are in the world and climate and so on. Well, there's maybe a third axis, which is control, right? How much control do you have over an asset as a landlord? Because remember, we are mostly talking to building owners, right, and managers, or who represent the owners. So if the tenant has full control, which is called triple net in the US and RFI in the UK and various other versions of this around the world, and they exist around the world. It's just I don't know the names around the world. Um, let's say you build an industrial campus and you build it as good as you possibly can, right? But then after that, you kind of just had to hand it over to a tenant, a logistics company, manufacturing company. You're not going to tell the manufacturing company how to do manufacturing, right? If they have a paint shop in there, is the landlord going to tell them you better have good filtration and you better not be off gassing paints and stuff like that? You can't. You don't have that level of control. And yet, I need to measure this somehow. So we need to figure out ways in which we can acknowledge these different sort of control structures, so we don't accidentally penalize certain business models without
Yeah,
meaning to.
there's a couple of things I want to unpack with you there. One of them is around this idea of data coverage. So where you're kind of putting your flag in the ground first, that you're not saying we're looking for you to achieve a certain X, but we're really benchmarking you on visibility, because down the road you can't manage what you don't measure. And really what we're saying is that, are you in a position to measure? And I think that there was a couple of things you were saying there about who's likely to do that. And I think that's really interesting. I've been talking about this analogy of cars for a long time, and the flow downstream of data. And one of the things that I've been trying to impress on the people that I have conversations with that build structures is to think about the automotive industry in that sense, in that if you're not the one putting the ability to collect data into your structure, then somebody downstream is likely to do it. But your access to that data becomes harder and harder the further downstream that's implemented, all the way to eventually the tenant. And, we have this particularly in housing, but even in commercial real estate, the challenges of split incentives, where the people that are interested in certain parameters may not be the ones that are managing the building, right? But you look at the automotive industry, they've understood for a very long time that it makes sense to be putting sensors into cars that aren't necessarily delivering any value primarily to the driver of the car. But every time you go to the mechanics and they plug their machine into the car to do a service, that's it's collecting that data and sending it back to the manufacturer of that product, so they can understand which fuel pumps wear out faster, which sensors have a better efficiency, and that feeds back, that creates a virtuous circle feedback loop where they can improve through iteration their product, which improves the value of their company, right? And we've seen with automobile companies, those that have done that well have been the ones that have been most successful long term. And that's kind of where real estate assets have got to get to. They've got to understand that, particularly in this world of nuanced decisions, of not just choosing something on the primary energy efficiency, they're going to have to make some balanced judgment calls on its embodied carbon versus efficiency or whatever it is. I need feedback loops to be making those decisions. I can't be doing it off of what a manufacturer of a product tells me. I need to be able to A and B profile choices in buildings and figure out which one does work in practice. All of that stuff doesn't happen without data. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about this kind of data coverage in that kind of term, where you're trying to understand. There's loads of really interesting dynamics going on here. You've got this binary nature of who does and doesn't have data. You've then got the value of that data coverage and what that means to the asset classes. It's a really interesting space. And we talk, and it's a trope of mine, we need to move towards performance, not theoretical performance of spaces. It's easy to say, but you're at the coalface of what that means. So it's a really interesting viewpoint.
Yeah, and it brings me back to something you were saying earlier about how we relate to sort of classic building level certification. right? And as you said, they've gone through that same evolution from asset rating to performance, right? And there is this interesting dynamic where we, from a client expenses perspective, GRESB is almost all operational expense, right? You don't spend money to do anything for GRESB when you're building the building, right? Now you could argue, as you just did, which I think is the right way to go about it, is like when you do a major intervention / construction, put in the sensors already. So not just because GRESB says so. I would love for GRESB to have that much power. We absolutely do not. But when you are building the building, build in the sensor so you can manage it better. And then that controls contractor, all they need to do is tie it all up into some sort of exportable API or spreadsheet or something. And you'd be surprised how many times that last mile fails, where I know in theory I have all the data I need from a building, I cannot get to it, right? And this is the most frustrating aspect of like that we haven't seemed to invented that your service plug, right? The laptop, the point. Actually, maybe the better analogy is if you go to a Kia dealership, they can't plug into a Renault, right, or a Ford, right? And that's somehow in real estate we've hit that without having those without having that kind of structure. So it's certainly frustrating to not have data that I think we should have. So it makes sense at the point of intervention to build in the data gathering already in anticipation of the fact that you will need that to assess the condition, you will need that to assess repairs, replacements, and in some cases to do things like report to GRESB so your investors know how things are doing, right? What's happening increasingly, going along the thread of how much data we actually want, right? So it looks like, and I don't have all the details worked out yet. We're kind of splitting into an assessment for buildings assets you can control, and the aspects you can control, and aspects you can't control. And then philosophically, it's about the same split as going into like operational certifications versus construction certifications, right? I'm not saying it's exactly the same thing. And in fact, we recognize building certifications as a thing you can have, and we give you points for that. We've been criticized for being too close to the building certs and giving them too much weight, which is more an accident of how the assessment was structured than anything that we deliberately said, no, we must encourage people to go out and buy certain kinds of building certs. We recognize every building cert under the sun. We've recently reformed that, and we've responded to the committee's requests for how to weight them. But I can tell you that the weight for building certifications is going down in the next version coming out in 2028 as we push harder on performance, measured performance. So it felt a little bit reductive or redundant rather to also have them building certs in the background, it's still something that is value for new assets that come online. And so they will get rewarded in the development phase or first year of ownership or whatever it is, or of operation. But as it starts operating, then measured values matter more. So the bit that we're trying to, from the aspect of saying, there's two things, what areas and buildings you control and ones that you don't. So when you control a building, we then have higher expectations of how much data you should have from it, what you should be able to do to its performance. So things like that. Keeping in mind that, and going back to my experience with installing air quality sensors, there are only so many sensors you want to install before you sort of introduce like fatigue and just too much electronics in the space and of no use. So thankfully, that's not really a problem with things like energy. I mean, there is only a finite amount of things to measure. And if you measure 100% of the energy flows, you're fine. That's what I need. I don't need you to start going down rabbit holes as far as possible. The side which is around, people that don't control the building that you don't control so well, the operations or the data, that we haven't quite figured out how to measure that. right? And there is a good case for why we should allow that, because frankly those assets exist in those companies, and in fact most companies have a mix of assets they have various levels of control over. So it I can't just exclude those assets and say take the hit, get a score of 0. That doesn't seem fair. And that's the part that is challenging for us. Like, how do I know? And I give you a simple example where it potentially is easy to measure. So let's say on-site combustion. I don't literally need you to give me the data if you can certify to me that there is no gas delivery on site. That's effectively 0. So there is no combustion on site. There's no fuel delivery on site. Fine. That's all I need to know, right? As a landlord, you could certify that I didn't put a gas connection in, and I can certify that there is no combustion on site. Fine, good enough. How I do that for energy efficiency, I don't know. Or air quality, I don't know.
Yeah, well, maybe something like the hierarchies of control are an interesting window into that space. That same, because that's effectively what you're talking about with the gas delivery. You can measure the engineering effectiveness of the building to manage the products of combustion or processing that might cause risk. But if you can, at the top of the pyramid, if you've got elimination, you've just eliminated gas and combustion from the building, then that data is worthless because you've eliminated that risk. Elimination is always from a risk lens, which is, we're kind of talking about the same thing with finance in a way, because finance is risk often. Is there's the eliminations and the substitutions before you get to the engineerings where you're trying to figure out the relative value of that risk at that point. Whereas if I've just removed that risk, it's a bit like removing the risk of flooding if your building's built on a hill, right? Yeah, flooding data is useful only if you're in an area that's likely to be flooded, right? So yeah, there are these kind of these binary entry points, I guess, into the data that goes like, this is the usefulness of that data set. Yeah, I guess at that point.
Yeah, I like the connection to hierarchy of control. I didn't make that myself, but that is exactly how we're going.
Really interesting. The other thing I was fascinated to talk to you about is this idea of relative benchmarking. Because in the world of environmental science and air quality, and we see it with things like well standards and WHO limits and things like this, we talk in terms of absolutes. Now, though those absolutes are still defined in star chambers of people sitting together and making a judgment call on what that value should be, but effectively it's pretty binary. You're either above or below a value. But GRESB kind of takes a different approach with relative benchmarking, which perhaps you're probably better at explaining than I am. But my rudimentary understanding of it is that the world of finance doesn't care what the absolute value of a building is. It cares about its value relative to the buildings around it, ultimately. Like it's location, isn't it? At the end of the day, or is this building better or less risky than the one next door? That kind of thing. Is that at a rudimentary level what relative benchmarking is? Is this, you have a score, but it's based on the other buildings in that score, ultimately?
That's where this basically starts, the relative benchmarking. So as a quick primer, the way that GRESB scores, or to begin with, it was about all the company data would be collected, and then based on what the KPI, the metrics, like if you knew what good looked like, you could say, or the direction of good, you could say, let's say more data is better. Having more data is better. More data coverage is better. Then you can rank sort building companies and eventually buildings by how much data they have. Right? And then you can make some calls on, well, what is a peer group? Right? Is the peer group based on location, on sector, on size? And these are all sort of messy classifications because there's rarely a company that's clean, lean one or the other. When we started as a company, this was only done at the company level, at the fund level, as we would call it. So a portfolio of buildings. As we moved down to the asset level, we said, well, even assets can be benchmarked in the same way. As you were just saying, it's actually, even if you have an absolute threshold for energy efficiency or air quality, like a SO2 or SOx or NOx or CO2, whatever, you could still have a hybrid approach where an individual building can meet or exceed a certain absolute target. But then as a collective, all your buildings, then there's a percentage of achievement, let's say. And then on that percentage of achievement, I can then rank your companies and your portfolios. And the reason we are always looking to rank is because that's what investors want, right? In many cases, and the reason they want that is because when GRESB started, most of the stuff we didn't either have data, or if we had data, we didn't know what good looked like, right? So I didn't know globally what is a good waste efficiency, waste production level. I don't know what a good water production level is, and so on. Now that I know for some things, like as topics mature, for energy, I do know much better now what efficient looks like than I did 20 years ago. I can start moving to this hybrid model that I mentioned of each individual building can be expected to meet a certain efficiency level. And then we can then assess what percentage of your buildings achieve a certain efficiency level or improvement, right? Everything is either absolute performance or improvement. We value both. And then I can say, as a portfolio, you have very high efficiency levels or you have very high improvement levels. So good for you. You're at the top of the pile, right? And from an investor's perspective, they would regard that as money well spent on ensuring that either this manager is really improving my building, so they ensure long-term value and value retention and income retention, or you could say from a perspective of the other end of the spectrum, say they've taken assets that were risky and they've basically made them not so risky anymore. So relative benchmarking, to put it simply, is to say that especially in situations where you don't know what good looks like on an objective scale, it is very useful to know how a company or a building is doing compared to its peers. The trick is making sure you define peer groups properly, which can get a bit complicated as you go global. And the trick is to not over rely on relative benchmarking alone, right? And so GRESB as a system is moving towards a hybrid of absolute and relative, where absolutes do exist and we can have consensus around this is a good number for an absolute benchmark, we will go for it. And then knowing that when you roll up to the company level, it's almost always going to be relative, because how many of your buildings achieve a certain level, then it becomes relative, right? Because 100% is good, but for offices in Vietnam, is 40% the average or is 20% the average, right? And it's possible that, and it actually happens all the time, that say energy efficiency, student accommodation in the UK has very high levels of achievement for energy efficiency. And compared to say student accommodation in the US, which is where it's used in the summer with air conditioning, the energy efficiency of UK accommodation is very, very high. So I cannot, a portfolio that's heavily invested in student accommodation in the UK versus the US, they're just going to look different. And I can't, it's needing to know how you're doing relative to the conditions and the control and market conditions that you have. I think that's the value of relative benchmarking.
I'll have you back to the podcast in just a minute. I just wanted to briefly tell you about Eurovent Certified Performance from Eurovent Certification, a partner of the podcast. We all know HVAC systems play a vital role in improving indoor air quality. However, there is a risk that some products may not live up to expectations. Even the best installed and maintained HVAC equipment can underperform if data used to specify products and design systems is incorrect. Consequences can include poor indoor air quality, increased energy consumption, increased maintenance, system failure, and non-compliance with regulations. And that's bad for everyone. However, there is a way to ensure products perform as advertised and deliver good, sustainable indoor environments. Selecting products holding Eurovent certified performance ensures that the manufacturer data has been independently and impartially verified. Eurovent certification's stringent certification process not only guarantees product performance, but energy efficiency too. I met some of the Eurovent certification team back in January at the Indoor Air Quality Matters conference and was seriously impressed with what they're trying to do. Their core aim is to create transparency in the industry by making certified data freely available. This means you can directly compare the performance of products to make informed decisions. Their certified product directory holds vital information on everything from air handling units to air filters. So don't take a chance on unverified products. Trust in proven performance. Details, as always, in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net and at Eurovent Certification. That's www.eurovent-certification.com. Now, back to the podcast. I think it doesn't take much imagination to string that out. You can see how that makes perfect sense, both geographically, like you say, a climate that really is energy intensive in just one season versus some parts of Canada where the temperature swing is 40 degrees through the year. Clearly, you're not comparing apples with apples in that circumstance. So you need to understand as an investor relatively how am I managing, how's that building sitting compared to others in its region. But also building typology, use, age. We've got a big difference between European buildings, most of which exist, versus buildings that are being built in the Middle East or India, for example. There's all the, I can imagine it's almost infinite, the potential for benchmarking, and that's the risk, that it becomes less useful the more you split it down. But nonetheless, it gives you that granularity that enables you to be fairer. And I imagine AI probably has a part to play there as well, that you can really start to benchmark in ways that you just wouldn't have had the time to before. With clustering and you as a data scientist, or the data scientists in your organization, there must be some fascinating ways of relatively benchmarking buildings based on k-means clusters or of certain data points or all sorts of, I can imagine it just being a data scientist's wet dream. This kind of relativity of data must be fascinating.
And what's interesting is that we collect a lot of data. So our breadth is very, very good, but our depth is not very good, right? From a building science perspective. So, I think about the work I've done with Tim Sharp from Strathclyde, and, the having a CO2 measurement is fantastic. But if I don't know the context in which it was taken, I'm like, okay, cool, I guess, thanks. I don't know what to do with it.
That's the value of breadth versus depth, is that lack of context can be rounded off by scale. And I think that's probably going to be the really fascinating transition here, is as we bring people from this binary of no data to shit tons of data, that done at scale, all of a sudden, it's not like there's going to be a gradual incline in the depth of data. It's just going to explode. That as you want to bring data coverage up, the scale of data is just going to absolutely explode in that sense.
Yeah. In fact, we have noticed that it takes the industry about 3 years to catch up to things, right? So when we introduce like, oh, hey, I would like you to measure energy at the asset level now, it takes the industry about 3 years to master energy management at the asset level. And some people do it more efficiently than others, right? Some people go straight to, how do I automate this? How do I make it as low cost as possible so that I can get to the real work of sustainability? as opposed to other people that say, I'm okay to call I have a cheap analyst and they can call every tenant every year. That's fine, right? And I'm not, I mean, obviously, for me personally, it's a little painful to call people and ask them for data, but sometimes that's what you have to do. So I would much rather have automated systems. It's interesting also that as we push on breadth actually just happens by the structure of how GRESB is, right? We're global. We have all sorts of sectors, all sorts of building types, all sorts of control types. But we do push on depth as technology and market appetite allows, right? And maturity allows. And when we do that, we realize that there is a very clear splitting of the market between people who do it well and people who don't do it well. And it's to do with sort of how much you're willing, what you think the value of the data might be, apart from just reporting it to GRESB, right? I think partly it's just to do with the culture in the organization. But when we try very hard not to ask for something that has no value outside of GRESB, right? So when we ask for a metric in GRESB, it usually comes from established science, right? So building science, let's say, in the case of buildings. When if I were to ask for some metric around CO2 levels, I would go to the literature, I would speak to academics, I would speak to industry leaders, and I would be like, what's a good metric we could use, right? Or grid interactivity. I don't know what a good metric is at the moment, but I'm out in the market. So if any of your listeners have a good metric for grid interactivity, please let me know. As we develop those metrics, we try to hit metrics that might be quite sophisticated at the level of an asset. Let's say percent of time that your CO2 levels are within some range. It could be a CIPC TM something range or Guide A range, or it could be a ASHE 62.1 range or whatever it is. But then the percent of time metric is then universal, right? It applies from Japan to Australia to San Francisco and everything in between. And that would be the ideal for me, because now I have a metric which is sufficiently localized and sophisticated at the building level, because I need you to have measurement. I need you to have a notion of, well, I don't need you to have it. I mean, it's available for you to use either an ASHE or a CIPC or something. And then the calculation itself is pretty simple. It's percent of time, and then it becomes universal, and I can grade it. That's like the ideal of what works. So the beauty of GRESB then is, because breadth just happens by how the system is structured, I am able to push so just a quick description. My role is providing the building science expertise. I have a colleague who provides data science expertise. I mean, that sounds excessively siloed, but so we both know each other's work, so we work together. And we support the standards development. So we support the secretaries of the standards committees, who are GRESB employees, to move the standard forward. So there is some element of governance. There's very strong governance procedures. So it helps me make the case to my standards colleagues, and together we make the case to the standards committee and the board that actually this thing we're asking you to do at scale is very doable. And in fact, most of your managers might already be doing it. And it helps us to address the fat tail of real estate that is often ignored when you put it in GRESB, because you can't score well in GRESB by addressing your one marquee building, right? Unless that marquee building constitutes 90% of your portfolio, right? That's a different matter. So you have to address a large portion of your portfolio to score well in GRESB. So this is a golden opportunity for me to impress things at scale, is once I can get consensus that something is worth measuring and scoring, and I can convince the committee and industry that actually you can do it, or you're even doing it already, you just need to tweak it a little, I can really start to address the really ignored buildings, which is a very difficult thing for your traditional building certifications to do.
And what you said there is absolute gold, and I think it speaks to the limitations of data when it's just a requirement. That if you're going to get broad adoption of data in buildings, you either have to have a very big stick, something that is at a regulatory level an absolute requirement. Now, we may see some of that come from the energy performance of building directives, but you really do have to be forced to do it because it's just a cost, and a lot of the organizations that are involved in the deployment of the technology that collects that data need more than that. They need sticky customers that adopt SaaS models and, continuous business. And it's very hard to get those customers purely on the basis of begrudgingly having to do it because it's a core part of their asset, right? So you have to operationalize that data. It has to be data that's valuable to more than just the spreadsheet at the other end of it, that it does something of value that means there's at some level an ROI of investing in doing it beyond the GRESB. And that I think is where the frontier of a lot of this stuff is, we saw a peak of interest in environmental monitoring because of COVID, obviously, because it would become a health and safety issue in buildings. But post that now, that industry is a little bit at sea because they're trying to demonstrate the value of deployment of sensors, and they're stuck in the woolly, fluffy world of cognitive impacts and performance. Like you say, I had an economist on here who was saying, there just isn't the data for this yet. It's just too light for economists to really bite. We're still in the world of trust us, we're academics, that there's an impact on cognitive impacts of good air quality. I think the sector that's really fascinating for people to keep a close eye on in this respect is social housing in the UK, ironically. It seems like a million miles away from glass-clad Deloitte headquarters in London. I don't know why I always pick Deloitte as the glass-clad headquarters, but anyway, I do. Sorry, Deloitte.
They're not the only ones, yeah.
Or LinkedIn, or whatever. Pick your enterprise business. But social housing's been a really fascinating one because the scale of deployment of data and data collection in that sector has absolutely exploded. And one of the reasons for that is that they've operationalized that data. They've found value, genuine value, for the providers of those assets in collecting data. Very simple monitoring of spaces is picking up fuel poverty risk, void risk, condensation, damp and mold risk, energy performance of buildings, efficacy of interventions and changes in those assets over time, trends, like unbelievable value that pays for the deployment of that technology many, many, many times over. And as the technology is improving, we're at the point virtually now where companies are pulling a tab out the back of a device, sticking it on the wall, and it's collecting through the GSM network and will last for 10 years and will beam out all the data you need on that room and that property to collect that data. And it's not the dashboard that it's producing. It's the works order programs and the customer service systems and the CRM systems that this data is beaming directly into that's having objective impacts on those organizations. And that for me is something that the broader commercial area of real estate hasn't quite grasped yet. In manufacturing, it's often to do with rules and health and safety and production critical environments that they need to know how things are performing. Think kind of silicon manufacturing, and chips and all that kind of stuff. But in offices, we still seem to me to be largely stuck at dashboards and ziggy-zaggy lines, and somebody needs to care enough about air quality, and maybe you might get a well score out of it. But we haven't really operationalized it yet in the same way. And I think that's what's interesting. I think what you're saying there is you see that, like, at the very end of the system, that there are people that get it and find ways to see value in this and will deploy quickly. And there are those that are doing it reluctantly, say, and they're the ones that are dragging their heels and slowing this process down. But that's on the industry. They need to figure out not just the value of reporting to GRESB. They need to find a way of showing real value for people in spaces of collecting this data.
Exactly. 100%. I mean, a slight tangent here. I would just like to, from a building science perspective, I can't believe an economist is calling us fluffy, right? There is so much fluff in economics and value and how we determine, unsentimental finance, as you said. It's a lot of judgment calls there. At the end of the day, the cost of something is more or less a judgment call. Right? The cost of a building, the gross asset value, these are all judgment calls, right? It's not like you could take the same materials, compose the same building in central London or central Tokyo, and you could do the same thing in rural India, and the cost of that building would be insane, worlds apart, only because we give more value to one collection of materials than the other, right? So from the world of air quality, like, we understand that even value judgments are valuable, right? Like, if you tell me you're uncomfortable in a situation, that has value as a data point, right? I don't need to wire you up with like sensors to know that, what was his core temperature, what was his surface temperature. If you tell me you're uncomfortable, that has value. Let me figure out if there's something I can do. Sometimes it's the building that's not performing to its specifications. Sometimes maybe there's an individual intervention. You could go for a walk, put on a jumper, whatever it is, right? So I think we should not negate the value of sort of relative and value and quality and all these things, because a lot of real estate is sold on the premise of quality and has value. But it's also the question of, so GRESB is more carrot than stick, right? The value of doing GRESB for managers, well, in the stick part is, your investor says, I need that information, you got to do it, otherwise you ain't getting my investment. So you have to do it, right? And those are often the people that are sort of dragged kicking and screaming into the system until they do it a couple of years and they realize, actually, I'm pretty good at this, and then they just zoom
That's
up.
a pretty big stick, right? Though, Parag.
It is a pretty big stick, like no money for you, right? Or the carrot is more money / cheaper money.
Cheaper money, that's the key. Bingo. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's this idea of sustainability linked loans, which can either say as simple, and actually in the UK now for home mortgages, there's a little bit of this happening where you can get a cash back for buying an efficient home. Unfortunately, as I discovered, you don't get cash back from your mortgage supplier if you move into a home and make it more efficient.
Interesting. Yeah.
Which is strange, right? Like, this is just my soapbox, sorry, and I think my wife is tired of hearing this, but like, I decarbonized my own home and then I made it a much better home. But if I'd bought a decarbonized home, I would have got a rebate from my mortgage supplier, but not because I did it after I moved in, right? So that'd be a strange outcome from a GRESB perspective, to only reward highly efficient buildings rather than rewarding people for investing to improve buildings.
Yeah, I wonder if you could get a reduction on your car loan for modifying your engine to make it more efficient. Probably not either. There's probably some logic buried in there somewhere about modification on homes. Yeah.
No, but in the case of homes and buildings, we do actually have great things to measure with, right? So the EPC is imperfect, but it's pretty damn good and it's very standardized. So I went from an EPC score of, 70 to 85. So give me a reward for that. And that's what sustainability linked loans are essentially doing, right? In much more sophisticated and varied ways. We see a lot of this in Asia, particularly, because the irony of GRESB is that because we're global, in some contexts, we are seen as irrelevant because it's too global. It doesn't take into account local conditions. And in some contexts, our cachet is, our big selling point is that we're global. So if you're either you want to disregard local targets because you don't think they're good enough or they're not relevant, or you just have foreign investors, right? So the Norwegian fund or the Danish fund or the Dutch fund wants to invest in Indonesia, what are they going to use? Obviously, the local laws have to be respected. Nobody's ever going to suggest violating the local laws. But what if there is not really a local energy efficiency law or an air quality law? Then what do you fall back on? Well, often you fall back on GRESB metrics, and you say you start at this position in GRESB in year one, and if you can either maintain a good position or you can get your position better, you get a percentage point reduction or a half percentage point reduction in your loan, which is huge, right? It pays for the program many times
And that
over.
brings me back to the relative benchmarking again. And it was a question, it was the second part of the thing, probably half an hour ago. I said, there were two things I wanted to unpack there. So this is typical of our conversations. It seems to me somehow, if we just focus on air quality for a moment, that we're missing a trick with relative benchmarking in this sector in some way. That everything we talk about, and I was just, because I've been reflecting a lot recently, you've got these global pledges for indoor air quality and the Global Commission for Indoor Air Quality and setting real fundamentals about air quality as a human right and all of that good stuff. But you then put that out into the big bad world of relatively very different spaces and environments and socioeconomic statuses and so on, that it lose some of its weight, for want of a better word. And I wonder if there is something in relative benchmarking that we're missing in air quality, that we need to find ways of describing these risks. Because this is what I like, right? Finance and investment and real estate, it speaks the language of risk. It is relative, right? But people's tolerance of risk is different. People's perception of risk is different. And that's no different in the finance world than it is in the real world with people and risk to health and well-being and so on. So ironically, we speak a similar language, but yet we're not talking about air quality in relative risk terms well enough. And I wonder if there's a golden thread in there somewhere that needs picking at, because it's very thresholdy, very binary air quality in that sense.
And what we found with thresholds and scoring is fluctuation around the threshold is the bane of my existence, right? Anytime you make a threshold, going from, if the threshold is 100 and 99 and 101 are probably not that different, and yet they could go from 0% score to 100% score, right? And that in GRESB world is not a great outcome, because you've artificially created a difference that doesn't actually exist in the real world. And I think in air quality, this is even more severe because of all the limitations of measurement, and the impact that, okay, there are certain toxic thresholds that I'm not talking about toxic thresholds here, right? Like, I respect the fact that there are thresholds of toxicity that are more they're harder than, say, thresholds of how much impact CO2.
Yeah, let's face it, right? Carbon monoxide is fairly binary. There's a threshold you reach where value doesn't really come into it, right? Like at the extreme end of this, there's that, right? But I think the grey middle is the interesting part of this conversation, right? There's no safe level of particulate matter, right? There is it is harmful by its very nature. So the ideal is zero particulate matter, but in the real world, that's if not unlikely, impossible. So when we set a threshold of, let's say, WHO 15 micrograms per meter cubed of PM 2.5, right? Just to pick a number, if that's even right. There are parts of the world where that's a great target to hit. All right. There are other parts in the world where good luck with that one. It's basically a worthless number. And that is the world of air quality. Different environments, different needs, different requirements, even with stuff that has a impact on health, absolutely. Risk is relative still in that sense, in that it means different things to different people. And even if you take it from a vulnerability perspective, we've had these conversations with Plum Stone and people like that um, about infection risk. My vulnerability to infection risk in an environment can be very different to somebody that's undergoing cancer treatment. So risk is relative in that sense. It's still the same risk in its absolute terms, but to different people, it's different things. So there's something in this that I wonder if there's something that could be teased out. And as you say, your worst nightmare is one of those binary scenarios where it's either compliant or it's not. It's above or below, right? And it makes it very difficult to quantify that relatively across a portfolio, because people are failing buildings over a difference, a plus or minus of a particular threshold that's irrelevant at the boundary condition. It just happens to be above or below that particular number, whatever it was set at. And what's annoying is, that number was set in compromise, in a big room of people with lots of judgment calls and lobbying and stuff going on. So the number is a number, not because that's the number at which it absolutely becomes harmful. That was just what was agreed through compromise as being the number we'll pick, right? And then half your portfolio is failing because it's crossed that arbitrary threshold. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, and I think back to, and this is a mistake I'm very much guilty of in the world of air quality monitoring. We think about, because we were selling to people that had money, as a business, we needed, as you said, we needed SaaS, annual recurring revenue, we needed to sell sensors. We were focusing on high grade A offices and that extra 2% boost in productivity that you can provide somebody who works at Google, right? To paraphrase my boss, Chris Pike, who uses, this analogy. And you know what? I think the Google office is probably fine, right? Unless there is something that we haven't yet figured out is harmful. I don't know, asbestos or something that back in the day, and we just realized later, oops, that was a bad thing. But right now, based on what we know about human health and its interaction with air quality and what we can measure, I think the offices of Schneider and Google and LinkedIn and these they're probably okay, right? And you're really, yeah, and your bang for buck is going to be nothing. Right? So I need them to get to a good enough in the GRESB view of the world. I need you to get to there. I don't. I want to be careful in saying that I'm not actually going to start questioning the WHO's recommendation for PM 2.5 exposure, right? And yeah, as you said, in PM 2.5, it's quite obvious 0 is the right number, right? And so what is the acceptable exposure? There's no such thing as good PM 2.5, right? Good level. So let's say that the WHO number is imperfect, but it's the best we have, so we'll accept it. The trick in GRESB is to design a scoring system that rewards both being under that level, which hopefully your Google office is just achieving by default and by design and where it is. But your Google office in Delhi has to do a lot of work to get to that number. And so it might start at a terrible place, which is outdoor Delhi levels, which is essentially some of the worst air quality in the world. And then we can reward you for big steps in the direction of what is good, right? So this is a crucial aspect of GRESB, is we will try our hardest to make sure that it's not just the premium A grade building that's already achieved a certain measure of sustainability that gets rewarded, but also ones that make substantial improvements which have good real world outcomes.
Yeah, so you kind of got your floor, your baseline entry points. Let's just stick on the PM, for example. Your 0 or below WHO levels is kind of a good place to get to. You've got direction of travel is taken into account for organizations that are investing in infrastructure. That shows intent. But then you've also got perhaps the relative benchmarking that says, well, yes, we might have 80% of the buildings above a WHO level, but relatively, I've got the top 20th percentile just above, say below 25, right? And I've got the middle quartile at 80, and I've got the worst quartile at 150 plus or something, right? So that's where relativity comes in, is that you can say, yes, absolutely, you get to this level, and that can be determined by all sorts of outside organizations that determine what good looks like, if there is a determination of what good looks like for something. And then you've got that direction of travel and that relativity. That makes an enormous amount of sense. What's interesting is I don't see that being deployed in air quality, right?
Yeah, I know it's very strange.
And to me, that seems like a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle. That's for listeners there. That's the people working on well and reset and you name all the others and lead and stuff. Maybe encourage them to think about that. Because it that's welcome to the world of risk. It's relative.
Exactly. And when I think about, like, if I don't have money to invest in anything, but if I did have money to invest in things, I have a certain investment thesis, which means I invest in long-term holds I hold for the long term, in manufacturing facilities in emerging markets in Asia, right? So that immediately puts me in a certain context, right? That's where the relativity example you gave is this is how it translates, right? So in fact, we've been working on refining how we produce these numbers as well to better reflect these investment theses. Because when we started as a company, the investment thesis was global. I can put my money anywhere in the world, in any sector, in any region. We're finding now more and more investors that come into the system actually have a specific investment thesis, like I only invest in Japan, I only invest in Northern Europe, and so on, right? Or I only invest in certain sectors because, I don't know, offices are going down and logistics is doing well, so I only do logistics. And as you said, within each bucket or peer group, which is guided by investment theses, and there's we have to design the system well so it doesn't become too complex and too granular, so you lose its all meaning. What is my relative level of achievement, and how much better than am I doing than the average? And that's what people care about. I want to buy the best possible offices in Western India, right? My thesis is only limited to Western India and only to offices. So the fact that, I don't know, logistics in Arkansas can achieve a certain level is of no relevance to me.
Yeah, and I really like that balance, that interplay of not being too granular, because like you can play that out in your head quite logically, that if basically it's your relative value of two buildings, that relativity becomes worthless, right? If I only want to invest in pink 7-story buildings in Oxfordshire, the relativity of that investment becomes worthless at some point, doesn't it? Right. And so you can kind of see that logic play out to its kind of straw man conclusion. But that's, I guess, where you're guided at a high level by the GRESB Foundation, effectively, to say, like, these are the likely buckets that we need to look at of relativity, effectively.
That's literally what I'm proposing to the foundation now. Like, I'm going to put out an article in a couple of days showing options of how we could refine our buckets, because right now so you get a score in GRESB and then you get a star rating, and the star rating is literally just your quintile, right? So 5 stars where you are. Okay. It's a ranked quintile. That's all it is, right? That's all it means, right? That's not how it's interpreted, though. People use the star rating to mean a measure of quality, right? And there's some obfuscation that happens during the process of going from asset reporting a piece of data all the way up to portfolio getting a star.
You need a different visual, Parag. That's the problem there. I mean, it's just 5 points, expressing
Exactly.
quartiles, but but people assume stars mean stars, So you probably need you need a different metric, a different visual, probably.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So we have been using other words like, I don't know. Well, quintile is too complicated. That's literally what it is, but we need a different word like rank or letter grade or whatever it
Sliding
is.
scale, something, expresses that.
Yeah, exactly. And what we realized is people interpret it as a measure of quality. So we are trying to improve how much, what it actually represents, and part of that is a refinement around theses. So your bucket is your ranking is relative to a relevant bucket, or it could be absolute threshold, which are narrative based, to say that in order to achieve 2 stars, you must have good data coverage. In order to achieve 3 stars, you must have good data coverage and achievement in 1 out of 4 pillars, and so on, right? So then you can then map back to say, if I'm buying a 4-star fund, I know that it has this level of data coverage, this level of achievement, this level of tenant satisfaction, blah, 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 whatever. Right? And that is, to me, a very powerful message as well. It's much harder to develop a narrative based sort of ranking system than it is to develop a relative one. But I think the time is now to start developing those narrative based systems, because we actually know a lot more and we have a lot more data. It'll be imperfect, but the beauty of GRESB is you can literally change it every year if you want. We don't want to do that. Now we have 3-year change cycles, but through consensus with the industry, I can arrive at, hey, this is like 3 ways we can do this. Give an example. There are 3 ways I can 3 windows I can use for rolling means: 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. And then I sit with the managers and be like, what is actually relevant for you? How long do you actually hold an asset? How long do you have to change it? If you do change it, how long do you want that to impact, right? And there's no right answer here. It's what we assume, what we assign value to, and how we want it to be evaluated.
Yeah, and I think for listeners that aren't aware of GRESB, it's very hard to describe the compound impact of GRESB. I mean, at this stage, you're effectively benchmarking trillions of dollars worth of assets. I mean, I was doing some research before this call, and the scale actually of the quantity of assets that, and it's not a one-time wonder. This is something that is, it's not locked in, but it is effectively looking at the long-term impact of those buildings. So changes here are meaningful. The stuff you're doing is having real impacts on where the money goes. As we know, where the money goes has real impacts on what we end up with. So it must be very rewarding work in that sense, which kind of brings me on to you, Parag, actually. How did you end up here? Because you're a building physicist in the world of what effectively is real estate finance and risk. There must have been some journey there, I guess, to find yourself here.
Yeah, it's I didn't set out to look for a job at GRESB, but rather what happened was, so I was in a job where I was doing, let's say, more classic building science stuff, developing software, decarb planning, air quality, and I was looking for a change. And I spoke to Chris Pike, who is the Chief Innovation Officer at GRESB. And he just joined in 2023, I think. He joined as Chief Innovation Officer. And he joined GRESB and realized that this is the bit we were missing. We had no building science expertise. We have some engineers in the company, particularly civil engineers, because obviously it's real estate, so you need civil engineers to do things like embodied carbon. We have lots of policy people. Well, not a lot, but we have policy people who understand carbon finance and carbon assessment and stuff like that. We have, we were lacking the building science expertise, which was becoming more and more of a problem the harder we wanted to push into building assessment. Right? When you're at the portfolio level, you can get away without having building science. But when you get to the building level, it starts to show, the problems start to show. So he and I were talking, and he was like, well, I'm keen to have this expertise in the company. So we talked, and he hired me. And initially we thought we should stick to buildings, but then we realized that actually there is an opportunity to make use of my broader skill set, which is civil engineering in general, right? And just energy flows, not just in buildings, but also around infrastructure, and to try and unify more and more how we assess assets at different scales, from the single building level to groups of buildings to other sort of wind power farms and so on, wind power generation and so on. And there are some things that actually connect really well, like how you assess energy, how you assess global greenhouse gas efficiency or decrease and so on, and some things that are quite specific to a sector, and that's fine as well. So my journey was, I suppose, it's because the company realized that they needed building science expertise, and that's how they came to, hire me into that role. And it really works because we had some data science expertise, and because I can do data science at some, let's say, reasonably amateur level. I can talk to that part of
you
the
know
world.
what they're talking about, at least. Yeah, which is always helpful. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. For the listeners, by the way, those of you who find yourselves a little flummoxed by data science, like I am quite often, coming from a classic engineering background, a lot of it is just like rebranded statistics, right? I know it's a little heretical for me to say this, but when this throw a word at you, like try to drill into what it is, and it's like, oh, this is actually the statistics I already do know. It's just done in a modern way. So it's perhaps using more data or more effective or worse data or better data, whatever it is. And that was the realization that really helped me. A friend of mine who worked with me for a little while in Tokyo, and he had me there as a visiting scientist. He helped me, Imtiaz Khan, and he helped me realize that the gap from like classic engineering and statistics and stuff to data science is not as big as we think. It's data science has done this amazing job of taking bad data or strange data or unlabeled data and things that don't require so much human intervention, and then making it work for engineering outcomes in a way that perhaps classic statistics didn't do a good job of. And everybody was confused by what is a good sample size and what's a p-value and things like that.
Yeah, it feels a little bit more live, data science. Statistics feels a bit kind of rear view mirror-ish in a lot of ways. I mean, interestingly, of course, there's now statisticians running around with their hair on fire, shouting at the whatever it is they're listening to this on. If there's any statisticians listening to this at all, what was interesting was your PhD thesis was on uncertainty, and I kind of smiled when I read that, because I imagine in a world of real estate and finance and so on, there must be some interesting dots you've connected in previous academic work to what you're doing now, I guess.
Absolutely. My one regret is I'm not able to use building simulation. Right. It's a very niche regret to have, right? But I think the listeners of this podcast will understand is that I'm not able to use building simulation on a day-to-day basis, but I do get to do lots of maths. So that's always a good outcome, right? Always happy days when you get to do maths. I think you said this earlier, the world of finance is very conversant with risk. They use it all the time, right? In fact, I would say more than engineering and architecture do. They actually really they think of risk, they price it in, they use it as part of their model, they use it as part of their day-to-day workings. And in fact, if you're not doing risk in finance, you are not doing a good job, right? You're not doing your job. And what I was trying to do in a sort of perhaps not the best way in my thesis was what actually during my thesis I kind of arrived at that conclusion, starting from classic engineering principles, energy plus simulations, and this is an input and that's an input, and I accept these defaults, blah blah blah, and I move up, and the fidelity of my simulations must be fantastic, and realizing that the real world is messy. The real world has actors that don't understand or don't agree with what you're doing, so they're not necessarily ready to give you data or cooperate in ways. uh, when you go into a building, you almost, if you have data at all, it's imperfect. Contextual data is a lot harder to get than you would think, like about the building itself. And at the end of the day, though, you got to buy the building or not. You got to improve the building or not. You got to sell the building or not. These are decisions you have to make. And the person in who's managing your pension is relying on another person to do make these decisions, and that person needs to make an investment decision, right? And I think this helps me a lot in my work, is to realize that what I was trying to push on from a climate risk perspective in terms of overheating, that was a specific uncertainty I was looking at, is what is the uncertainty in the simulations from a climate perspective. Actually, you're right, is exactly the same language, the same concepts as pricing in risk due to flooding, or pricing in risk due to market shifts, right? Like what COVID did to office tenancies, right? That's affected GRESB indirectly, because our clients, who are the managers of those office spaces, can't lease them out in the same way they used to, or markets have shifted. And so the performance of portfolios have shifted. People are selling assets that they used to own and buying other types of assets. So it's a strange connection, but actually it turns out we are trying to get to the same sort of answers when it comes to risk and uncertainty, using different words and different starting points. So I try my hardest to translate what I would do as a calculation into language and metrics and stuff that the other side of the table understands and hears, because they're like, oh, I know this metric, like I understand this, right? And then I can have this influence on them to say, actually, yeah, your flood risk really matters to your income.
Yeah. With your background, is the purpose of GRESB, do you think, always going to be the rearview mirror, in the sense of it's always last year's data, it's the data that's being collected? Or do you think, I mean, because the world of finance is a modeling world as well, you know, the data that you're collecting and producing are going into, I imagine, fairly sophisticated models upstream to try and decide where assets go, so where investments go. Is there an element of this at some point that does become digital twinning and AI and modeling and kind of predictive in nature in some way? Because you're becoming a huge repository for the performance of spaces. I imagine that information is like you said, the modeler in you must be itching with opportunity to go, oh, I wonder, you know. Do you think there's a line there somewhere? I mean, at the moment it's a firm line. It's very much historical, right? But is there an opportunity for GRES to be forward thinking in that sense?
Absolutely. In fact, we are actively thinking about the in a sort of gross term, the predictive power of GRESB, right? And the predictive power of GRESB is not going to be in the sense of the kind of digital twin that a controls company can build for you, or a consultant. That's a different fidelity and different world altogether. GRESB is never going to get into the business of saying, if you do this particular intervention in the building, here's the ROI, the payback, and whatever. And this is the performance changes, and this is what your woofy modeling to do this moisture that's not our world, right? But our world instead is, we've created this artificial system of scores, right? And this system of scores represents material subjects and themes for risk and income and so on. Right? So once you buy into that, then you know that a higher score is better. Fine. And each asset contributes to the company's score, or or makes it worse, right? Either makes it better or makes it worse. So in my world, I can actually use the metrics that I know about an asset, or a new asset you bring me a new asset and you know some things about it, but not other things about it. I can then model the impact this will have on the when it leaves the seller's portfolio and when it enters the buyer's portfolio, right? The score contribution, as we call it. And we already have elements of this in a more static sense in GRESB already. So right now we can tell you what the score contribution is in the portfolio you submitted to me, but I can't tell you what happens at the point of transaction. So much like in theory, when in the UK you buy a building, you should look at the EPC and go, this needs about £1 million worth of work. I should price that in. In theory, you should do that. They don't always do that. In a similar fashion, I should be able to tell you that this, assuming all the permissions have been worked out, when you buy an asset of this nature or this characteristics, it'll have this kind of impact on your GRESB scores, which you can then have a conversation with your investor about, saying, hey, this is my strategy. I'm going to go into these markets for these reasons, or and there's good money to be made here and all that. But here are the risks that I'm taking on. So I'm going to invest this much money in improving those risks.
Yeah, like you said, the level of improvement in a Google headquarters might be fairly limited, but if you're an investor that wants to invest in the 1 and 2 star assets in a GRESB class, but you've got models for improving those scores with the nature of the business that you do, then all of a sudden you want to know. You want to say, actually, that this approach, I think I can bring this percentage of buildings relatively up a level, and that has an impact on.
I mean, there is a class of investors in GRESB who want to own only premium assets, 5 and 4 star and high scoring assets. Therefore, there's a class of investors who will buy 1 and 2 star assets, bring them up to the 4 and 5 star level, buy brown, sell green, right? So they benefit from the brown discount on one end, as in the discount that comes from highly risky, inefficient buildings. They are able to do the renovations and improvements in a way that's cost effective and good for the long term and so on. And then they're able to benefit from the green premium, which is a premium that people are willing to pay for good buildings and good assets. And this is a great outcome because I am now directing capital to exactly where it's needed.
Yeah.
Right. Improvements.
Yeah, exactly. What do you see the trajectory of indoor air quality in the GRESB world being over the next few years? Because it's clearly an impactful measurement of buildings, and the more we can show the impact of air quality, the more we'll get people to move in this sphere. How do you see, in your mind's eye, the trajectory of how air quality is valued in your world?
So if you read our Road to Performance, the newest publication, we publish every year our roadmap. And the newest roadmap is the theme for real estate is the Road to Performance. We have clearly delineated different themes or subjects that we are going to tackle one by one and make that subject mostly about performance and much less about disclosure, because we think it's ready. So there is a sort of health and well-being, employee safety, that kind of bucket there, the pillar there, which is currently regarded as fairly immature. But there is a maturity curve we can work on, and it's one of the next priorities. I don't know exactly what the sequence will be and exactly when it will be implemented. But what I see happening is we have this, like, think of it as a curve of, like the crossing curves of disclosure goes down and performance goes up, the relative importance of, as a subject matures. So I see air quality starting in this sort of disclosure era of, do you have the data? Have you put in the sensors? Have you got programs to use the data? Stuff like that, like just intentions and disclosure. And then moving towards, actually, are you delivering clean air in Delhi or not? Right. And that's what matters. And again, the relative benchmarking and all that comes into the picture, which is already built into the system. So I don't need to worry about that. I just need to make sure I find the right metrics that are benchmarkable, that are collectible, that are measurable, so that we can have a level playing field. And air quality has the floor. Certainly we will work on the floor, and we'll work on sort of the quality aspect. So yeah, don't be in a toxic environment, but also like move towards quality. And I think both things are. So the principles that we've established, I think, are fine. Principles being, if you're at high performance or if you're showing good improvement, both are valuable and they both get scored positively. Whether they get equally scored or not is a different matter. Depending on the maturity of a subject and how globally it can be measured and everything, we will move from disclosure to performance. Right? We will allow some level of specialized benchmark rating, like specialized scoring, to say that, and I don't know how this would work in the current system of stars, but to say that a thematic score, a thematics rating is possible. Actually, I know it doesn't work in the current global system, which is why we're proposing this alternative. So you could have a fund, let's say in Indonesia, in Jakarta, that exclusively focuses on, to begin with, energy and air quality only, because in that market, those are two, actually flooding, flooding, these three things really focus on, and that's fine, that's good enough. So you do those three things, and then as you mature, you move on to the other aspects of GRESB, and you choose those pillars. There will always be a foundation. So think of it as a Greek temple. The foundation is the company has to be managed in a certain way. The pillars are the different subjects, and then the pediment on top with a nice frieze on it is going to be innovation, saying that there are things we don't cover. There are ways you can overperform. Biodiversity is a good example, right? A lot of Asian managers are really keen on biodiversity, especially in urban environments, bees and insects and pollinators and stuff. So I don't want to cut that off, but I need a good way to continue to say that, hey, you've done something that's really valuable and for the world and for risk and everything, and good. So we should do that. That's how I see air quality entering the GRESB sphere in all the ways that we've just discussed, is following the same trajectory from disclosure to performance, relative benchmarking, until it becomes truly a mass.
That's the question, is where it sits in that visualization of being the pediment or the pillar, because people in the air quality world would obviously say clearly it's a pillar, a built environment. A built environment with poor air quality is not a sustainable building. It's clearly a fundamental pillar, but from an assessment perspective, it doesn't sound like it's really at the pillar stage yet. We need to move it. We need to be demonstrating that this isn't just about collecting data, that we're actually doing something with the building that's meaningful, that improves its value. Now, that work is happening, and we see things like buildings that have building standards will have a higher value than those that don't, and so on. So we're getting there, but it'd be interesting to see that trajectory happen from a finance end. And I think that's what Stefan Flagner was saying, the economist, who I'll tease him about what you're saying about fluffy. You probably know Stefan Flagner anyway, but yeah, it's that idea is we need more evidence. It's not that the evidence isn't good science. It's just we need to be showing the impacts of good air quality on the things that make assets valuable. That's the key. We need more of that, and that's what at the moment makes it light. Not fluff is probably the wrong word, but too light, too thin.
I will criticize the field of building science and air quality in particularly for one thing, which is to say, and maybe this is something we were led into rather than we wanted to go into, is I don't need, and in the first instance, it'll be very hard for me to show things like productivity, but I can get into showing things like, well, I know PM has an impact on you, so you should have little to no PM, right, in your space. Like the pollution angle is something I can actually work with, I think, much faster than the productivity angle, because I don't know when we'll get to a good enough measure of productivity.
Well, actually, interestingly, that's perhaps where that crossover with the work on harm intensity is happening at ASHRAE, where we're looking at DALYs, disability adjusted life years. I mean, that the beauty of a DALY is it's a financeable metric. There's a cost to society of And they've been able to show, at the moment residential, but they've been able to show that there's a cost in years lost to life and disability for certain levels of exposure to pollutants in properties. So for example, in the residential setting, homes currently as they are typically across the Western world have a DALY equivalent to smoking, twice as much as alcoholism. So we know there's a real financial impact of this. And if you built the homes to code, which we know we're not doing, that's why it's so high, even if you built it to the ASHRAE 62.1 or 2, whichever the residential one is, 1, 2, that DALY would drop to 1,000 years per 100,000, which is more equivalent to where road traffic deaths and injuries are, right? So that's the beauty of that work. But the first part of that work was DALYing it, figuring out what that metric was. But the follow on from that is what DALYs do is enable the economists to come in then and start saying, well, this is the cost to society, or this is the cost to portfolios to bring it down a level. So that maybe that work is starting to develop. So rather than at a precise level within a building saying this is what the absenteeism impact is of poor air quality or the cognitive performance, because there's so many factors that influence, so many confounding factors that influence all of that. What we can say at a population level is that if you build a building to this level, this is the DALY impact statistically within the people that work there.
Which gives me a direction of travel. And that's what I need. I need a metric and a direction of travel. And that's good enough for me to start with. Right?
Parag, absolutely fascinating talking to you. It's been a really interesting dive into GRESB. I think a lot of people would have learned an awful lot about it because like I say, it's one of those names because it's a funny sounding name and people are not quite sure how to pronounce it when they see it. But then probably not a lot of people actually knew what it was. So nothing else, I've learned loads. I think it's been absolutely fascinating and always fascinating talking to you anyway. And Chris is a legend as well, obviously in the field, and always fascinating to talk to. So if people get the opportunity to engage with you folks, I think it's always worth doing because you're doing some amazing work and impactful, which is the important thing. Thanks a million. Really, really enjoyed talking to you this morning.
Thank you for having me. It was good fun. Yeah.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? Before you shoot off to whatever it is you have to do next, or even the next podcast, if you enjoyed what we've been talking about here, please do spread the word and let's keep building this community. And don't forget to check out our sponsors in the show notes. Ultra Protect, Eurovent, Erico, ACO, Farmwood and Zender, all amazing companies, and without them this podcast would just simply not be possible. Check them out in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net and do check out our YouTube channel. All this content is there, plus much more. See you again next week.